And in that sound, in that moment of breathless stillness, Sarah understood with bone-deep certainty, this wasn't just the turning of a season, this wasn't the ordinary passage of time. No, something had awakened in Elmore Hollow, something buried long ago beneath the soil, beneath the silence, beneath the lies. It had waited there, patient and undisturbed, listening as the years passed, and now, it had risen, not with fury, but with purpose, watching, choosing, and the first to sense its coming were those who remembered the stories too old to be written, and too dangerous to be spoken aloud. The fog rolled in before first light, not in slow curls, but in dense suffocating swathes that devoured every hedge, chimney, and cobblestone of Dunswell Hollow, casting the village in a gloom so heavy it felt unnatural, almost sentient, as if the mist itself was watching. Miss Cora Bellamy, a woman with bones older than most of the parish, but a mind sharp enough to slice through pretense, stood at her frost-kissed window, one hand hovering above her tea as she stared out at the street, where no shadows moved and no birds dared sing. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the silence, it was the quality of it, like a room just vacated by something unholy. Then she saw it. Isabel Hargrove, the schoolmaster's niece, barefoot and running full tilt down the cobbled lane, her nightgown soaked and her face frozen in a mask of silent horror, as though whatever had driven her into the dawn had stolen her voice along the way. At that same moment, a single toll of the chapel bell cracked the silence, not the rhythmic peal of worship, but one dreadful hollow clang that sent a shudder through the village's spine. Wordless and tight-lipped, neighbors emerged from doorways and gardens, drawn together like iron filings to a magnet of dread, and followed the growing murmur toward the east end of the village, where St. Olwen's chapel stood hunched beneath the elms. Miss Bellamy joined the gathering, her every step through the dew-slick grass echoing with the heaviness of intuition. By the time she arrived at the iron gate, Reverend Pomeroy was already standing pale and shaken beside Constable Brigg, who, despite his usual bluster, looked like a man who had seen something that would unmake his sleep for nights to come. Then came the whispers. Harriet Dobb had found her while delivering salves to the vestry, a smear of blood across the font's stone base, the chapel door ajar, and little Mildred Poole, the missing station master's daughter, curled beneath the altar in a posture of eerie reverence, her hands folded as if in prayer, but her eyes wide open, glassy and unblinking, staring straight into the beams above. She had been missing 3 days, presumed a runaway, but now that seemed like a comfort compared to what had truly happened. And what chilled Cora to the bone wasn't just the death, it was the date, the 23rd of September, precisely 7 years to the morning since the Thornley twins had vanished during harvest preparations, their last known location marked only by 2 small handprints on the fogged window of the same chapel. Their bodies had never been found, their names rarely spoken, and now, here again, a child, alone, found at the altar on the same day the mist returned. But there was something else, something no one else noticed. Elias Kent, the former rail porter, now leaning quietly against the stone wall, his face chalk white, and his eyes not on the body, but on the bell tower above, lips moving as if reciting something long memorized. Cora watched him with the growing certainty that he knew more than he would ever say aloud, because he was there the night the Thornley boys disappeared. And back then, he had sworn to the vicar that no one would ever know what was buried beneath the chapel floor. As murmurs grew, and the doctor's motor car pulled in, Miss Bellamy stepped back into the shadows, heart racing not with fear, but grim readiness. This wasn't grief settling over Dunswell Hollow, it was reckoning. And this time, whatever had been locked away behind silence and ritual had found its way out. Something was returning, slow and sure, rising with the fog and the fall of leaves. And the village, whether it admitted it or not, had always known this season would come again. From her vantage point near the old greenhouse, where ivy clung like skeletal fingers to shattered panes, Miss Eliza Thornhill peered across the frost-bitten orchard, to where a loose knot of villagers had begun to gather in hushed disarray around the abandoned mill's west courtyard. a place long regarded with uneasy reverence since the day the Wheelwright family vanished without explanation over a decade ago. Word had spread swiftly through the narrow lanes of Brambleford Hollow. Martha Ellery, the quiet spinster who kept to herself in the yellow-doored cottage near the vicarage, had been found at dawn, lifeless and twisted at the base of the disused grain silo, her arms stretched unnaturally overhead as though reaching for salvation, or resisting something that had pulled her down. "Most dreadful business," murmured Dr. Havisham, his voice tight with discomfort as he stepped through the broken gate, his well-polished boots crunching over brittle frost and splintered grain. "She appears to have suffered a fall, though quite how she came to be up there." He trailed off, glancing toward the rusted ladder that clung precariously to the silo's flank, its rungs slick with moss and wear. Miss Thornhill, her heart heavy, and her instincts sharper than ever, recalled how only 2 days prior she had observed Martha at the grocer's, glancing over her shoulder with such anxious regularity, that it had struck her as deeply troubling. That she should meet such a violent solitary end, now seemed no accident of fate, but the grim fulfillment of some long-brewing fear. Mrs. Larch, whose arrival was as swift as her gossip was persistent, whispered with pale lips, but she never went near the mill. She feared it always said the place had voices. Constable Ridley, already pale beneath his cap, approached the crowd with a forced authority, declaring, "Please, none of you must approach the silo. Inspector Fenwick is en route from Greystone, and has requested the area remain undisturbed." But Eliza, never one to be distracted by formalities, had already noticed several things that tugged at her practiced intuition. Muddy bootprints circling the base of the silo, far too large for Martha's diminutive frame, and a peculiar smear of what looked like crimson oil along one of the ladder's lower rungs. Most unsettling of all was the strange discoloration beneath Martha's fingernails, a yellowish stain that reminded Eliza of sulfur, a detail dismissed too quickly by Dr. Havisham, who seemed all too eager to rule it a tragic accident. Inspector Fenwick's arrival added an air of stern finality to the proceedings. A gruff, impatient man, he surveyed the scene with an air of practiced detachment, then pronounced, "An unfortunate fall, no doubt. Old structure like this, nothing strange about its failure." But Miss Thornhill, standing very still near the frost-covered brambles, felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. The mill, dormant for years, bore no signs of recent collapse. The ladder, though rusted, had not broken, and Martha Ellery, timid, methodical Martha, would never have climbed that silo in daylight, let alone at night without a reason. And now there were rumors, quiet but insistent, that strange lights had been seen near the mill at twilight for 3 nights running. A low hum too, like a chant, heard by children who passed by on their way from school. The villagers, heavy with unease, began to trickle back to their homes, muttering prayers, and half-forgotten tales of what the wheelwrights had once disturbed beneath the mill's foundation. But Eliza remained, her gaze fixed on the old weather vane that now spun furiously despite the still air. Something had awakened in Brambleford Hollow, something buried deep in silence and superstition, and now it had taken Martha. As the sun slipped behind the orchard trees, casting the yard in long spidery shadows, Eliza Thornhill knew with grim certainty this was no accident, and whatever had started had only just begun. By the time the sun began to dip behind the hedgerows of Eldergate, the tragic tale of Clara Weston's untimely end had surged through the village of Briar Hollow like wind through dry leaves, swift, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Everywhere Miss Lillian Hargrove went, from the baker's quiet stoop to the pews of the ivy-covered parish church, murmured fragments of the event clung to conversations like burrs to wool. Clara, the reserved yet kind-hearted young woman who had worked at the old Thornbridge apothecary, had been discovered lifeless beside the ancient well behind her family's cottage, an unsettling location that evoked half-forgotten tales of whispered curses and inexplicable vanishings from a generation long past. Lillian had always believed that in small communities, reactions to tragedy often revealed far more about the living than the dead, and thus she found herself that morning at the village co-op, pretending to sort through gardening almanacs while listening to Mrs. Fenwick and Miss Crail discuss the unfolding mystery with breathless urgency. She'd been strange lately, Mrs. Fenwick confided in a half-hiss, always glancing over her shoulder, jumping at the postman's knock, and then those sealed envelopes. Identical handwriting, no return address. Miss Crail leaned in, her fingers tightening on the handle of her basket. And the strange herb she asked about, nightshade if you please. She claimed it was for an essay, but who writes essays in the middle of the night with candles burning and curtains drawn? Lillian, her features composed in polite neutrality, committed every word to memory as she continued her quiet route through the village, arriving next at the western cottage with a small bundle of lilies in her gloved hands. The door was answered by Clara's elder brother Julian, a man whose graying temples and meticulous attire spoke of lifelong restraint and unspoken burdens. He ushered her into a parlor that smelled faintly of lavender and old grief, its symmetry disrupted only by a teacup still resting on the windowsill. Clara's last, untouched. "We were planning a holiday," Julian murmured, his voice cracking with a pain too ordered to be fresh. She'd spoken of leaving the hollow, starting anew, and yet, he trailed off, his gaze falling to the floor, where a thread from the corner rug had been plucked loose as though by nervous fingers. Lillian's sharp eyes caught other things too. A drawer left slightly ajar, its contents too neatly disturbed. A faint sickly scent beneath the lavender that suggested tinctures not stocked by any reputable apothecary. Her heart beat faster, but her expression remained mild. As she left, Julian's hand lingered a moment too long on the doorknob, and his eyes flicked toward the well, where a crow now perched in solemn stillness. There was sorrow in Briar Hollow, yes, but sorrow alone did not explain the sleepless glances, the coded letters, or the scratches on Clara's wrist described by the constable as bramble-born. Though no brambles grew within 20 yards of the well, Lillian Hargrove, whose instincts had not failed her in 37 years of village living, walked home with a certainty growing like storm clouds behind her ribs. Clara's death was no accident, and what the village saw as still waters beneath morning's surface hid far darker currents indeed. The morning sun filtered weakly through the thinning September leaves, casting dappled patterns across the worn cobblestones of St. Hensley, a village that had until recently existed in an unremarkable stillness. But now something had shifted in the very air. The usual hush held a different weight, as if it carried a secret. A woman was dead, not just any woman, but Vera Langley, poised, private and unwaveringly composed, found lifeless in the shallow reed-lined pond behind her house. The villagers whispered their theories in restrained tones over their hedges and shop counters. She often walked there alone, some said. She'd been quiet lately, withdrawn. But none could explain why Vera had gone to that pond, or how she had ended up in it. It might have ended as an unfortunate tragedy, a woman perhaps overcome by melancholy. But then came the letters. No return address, no signature, just terse, anonymous notes written in a jagged, anxious hand. "If what you saw is revealed, everything will come undone." Found hidden in a jewelry box tucked deep inside a linen chest, far from where any visitor might chance upon them. From that moment onward, Vera's death transformed from an accident into a riddle. That was when Miss Eloan Hartley took notice. The retired schoolmistress, long regarded as little more than an aging relic by the younger villagers, still possessed a mind as sharp as frost, and a patience honed by decades of watching, listening, and remembering the things others forgot. She had seen death before. She knew the subtle tremors that preceded calamity, and she knew when someone was lying. Her first call was to Edwin Langley, Vera's father-in-law, the stiff and reticent master of the Langley farmhouse. Though he spoke in a low, mournful tone, something about him felt rehearsed. His home was spotless, perhaps unnaturally so, as if every surface had been scrubbed of something invisible. Miss Hartley noticed the shelf in the parlor, a gap among framed photos, where a picture had once stood. There were faint marks on the wallpaper behind it, a rectangular ghost of something deliberately removed. Vera had been distant, Edwin murmured, checking his watch again and again. Her nerves were never the same after that business with the calf dying last spring. But Miss Hartley saw the truth not in his words, but in what he tried not to say. His suit was too expensive for a man claiming financial strain. His shoes too new, and the look in his eyes, not sorrow, but calculation. More troubling still were the whispers she gathered from Millie, the village laundress, who remembered seeing Vera clutching a small leather-bound diary during her weekly visits. One day she tore out a page right in front of me. Millie said, voice low. Her hands were shaking like whatever she wrote had scared her. That evening, Miss Hartley returned to the Langley house under the pretext of delivering condolences. While Edwin stepped away to fetch tea, she subtly examined the window ledge of Vera's room, a favorite hiding spot for many a young girl. There, wedged behind the heavy curtain rod, and nearly crumbling with damp, she found a scrap of torn paper, the ink smudged but still legible. If Edwin finds out, it's all over. The pieces were coming together, but the picture remained elusive. What had Vera known? What had she seen, or done, that led her to fear her own family? And then, just as the puzzle threatened to lose shape, fate dealt another card. The next morning, while Miss Hartley was trimming the brittle remains of her summer roses, she spotted young Lorna, barely 13 and usually all chatter, hurrying down the lane with a tight grip on a yellowed envelope. Her cheeks were flushed, eyes darting like a frightened bird's. It was clear she was trying to go unnoticed, but Miss Hartley's voice rang soft and firm across the hedge. Lorna dear, is everything quite all right? The girl froze. Her lip trembled. And in her trembling hand the envelope bore the same sharp slanted writing as the anonymous notes found in Vera's drawer. Something dark was unfolding beneath the village's prim exterior. The truth hadn't drowned with Vera Langley. No, the truth was alive, breathing, hiding in shadows. And Miss Hartley had seen too much of human nature not to know when death visits a village once it rarely comes alone. She froze instantly, her fingers curling protectively around the edge of a brown envelope as though contact alone could shield its contents from exposure. Clara's eyes, wide, glassy, snapped toward Miss Elira standing silently at the garden gate, her presence as quiet as a shadow but heavy with perception. Clara's face youthful and open like a page yet unmarked by life's darker inks, twisted into the unmistakable expression of someone caught not in wrongdoing necessarily, but in something hidden. Oh, Miss Elira, she stammered, almost dropping the envelope, her voice brittle with unease. I wasn't, I just needed to. Her words fractured under their own weight. But Miss Elira, calm as ever, only tilted her head slightly and smiled. A gesture that was never merely kindness but a subtle invitation to disarm. Come inside, dear, she said softly, her tone wrapped in a grandmother's care and an investigator's edge. You look rather pale. I was just about to make some tea. Company makes it taste better, I always say. Within moments Clara found herself nestled within the warm cocoon of Elira's sitting room, surrounded by the faint scent of lavender and worn books, her trembling hands wrapped around a delicate cup of tea whose warmth contrasted with the chill in her veins. The ticking clock on the mantel filled the silence between them until Elira, without looking up, spoke with that familiar nonchalance that often preceded revelation. Lenora's death must have been quite the shock. You worked with her, didn't you? In the historical archives. Clara nodded too quickly. Yes, miss. Only part-time. During cataloguing surges, Lenora was always so precise about things. Elira's eyes flickered briefly with a knowing light. I imagine she took pride in that archive. Oh yes, Clara replied, her voice becoming steadier as she clutched routine like a rope. She kept everything perfect, binders aligned, climate control logged daily. Even the older manuscripts were aired just so. And she especially focused on the lower storage, the old archive basement beneath the west wing. She said it was ideal for the more sensitive materials. Elira nodded slowly, her fingers circling her own teacup. And lately, anything out of the ordinary? Clara hesitated, then bit her lip. She'd been down there more often, hours at a time. I'd leave and come back and her office would still be empty. She told me she was reorganizing. But? Elira prompted gently, sensing the weight behind Clara's pause. It didn't make sense, Clara whispered. That cellar is already immaculate. Every ledger, every shelf labeled in her own handwriting. But she wouldn't let me help, said she preferred to handle it alone. I thought maybe she was hiding something. The words seemed to echo in the room. Elira poured more tea, calm, steady, letting the rhythm soothe Clara's unraveling nerves. Did she ever explain what required so much secrecy? Clara shook her head, her voice dropping. She got defensive if I even asked, and then, I started noticing things. Her eyes flicked toward the door instinctively. Once I forgot my scarf and doubled back. I heard voices in the basement. Not Lenora's alone. There was a man. Low voices. Heated. Arguing. I didn't recognize the other voice, but it sounded urgent. Angry. Elira remained motionless, her thoughts folding inward. Clara continued, her voice barely audible now, as though saying it aloud would make it more dangerous. I asked Lenora about it the next day. She insisted I must have imagined it. Said the pipes make strange noises in the winter. Her lips quivered. But miss, there were no pipes near that corridor. And then, there was the fire. Elira's eyes narrowed slightly. What fire? 2 nights before she died. I saw her in the rear courtyard, burning papers. Not old ones. New, fresh typewritten sheets, thick manila folders. Even some photos, I think. She kept looking over her shoulder like she was afraid someone was watching her. Clara's breathing quickened. After that night, she was different, nervous, kept double-checking the locks. I think someone wanted whatever she found, and she realized it too late. Elira didn't speak, but within her mind, old war-era memories stirred. Encrypted letters hidden in flour sacks, secret ledgers buried under chapel tiles. The fragile balance between truth and silence. It was always the same. Someone uncovers too much and begins to feel watched, followed, hunted. And now Clara sat across from her, young, frightened, holding the edges of a puzzle soaked in shadows. Whatever had started in that archives basement hadn't ended with Lenora's fall. It was still unfolding, still breathing in the silence, and Clara might already be its next chapter. It had been just after sunrise when Mrs. Halbray, a quiet widow known more for her roses than her opinions, spotted young Thomas Brigg emerging from the eastern side of the abandoned blacksmith shed, his boots caked with damp soil, and his shirt torn at the hem, as though he'd crawled through something he shouldn't have. Miss Althea Cray, ever the early walker, and not above indulging in discreet curiosity, happened to witness the same boy later in the morning at the greengrocer's, hands shaking as he fumbled coins for a bundle of parsnips, his eyes darting like a creature aware of being watched. But it wasn't until the local schoolteacher, Mr. Linton, dropped by Miss Isadora Flint's cottage, with trembling fingers clutching a sealed envelope, one he claimed to have found pinned beneath the school's chalkboard, that the quiet churn of unease truly began to stir across Marrowdown. The note inside, written in an urgent but trembling hand, read only, "It's beneath the orchard stones. God forgive me." That evening, Miss Flint hosted a quiet gathering for the Ladies' Preservation Circle, though the conversation was anything but preserved. Whispers circled about strange movements near the orchard at twilight, a figure seen crouched low among the trees, and the faint sounds of metal grating stone. But when Mrs. Edwina Hartley suggested reporting it all to Constable Merrin, a silence fell over the parlor, heavy and awkward, until Miss Flint poured more tea, and changed the subject to chrysanthemums. The following morning, Miss Cray, drawn by that same itch of instinct that had served her well during the ration years, walked the long way round, finding herself conveniently positioned near the orchard wall just as Mr. Farrow, the church sexton, exited the rectory with what appeared to be a leather-bound ledger tucked under his coat, and a face pale as candle wax. She watched him cross the village green, without once looking up. Later she would swear, he paused outside the general store, seemed to whisper something into the shadows, then disappeared down Hollow Lane. But it was when Miss Flint's cat refused to enter the cellar, hissing and backing away with its tail bristling, that something deeper clicked into place in her mind. She remembered the delivery boy mentioning that the new crates of preserves were being kept above ground this year, just until the odor clears, though no one seemed able to explain what odor that was. And then there was the curious fact that the village solicitor, Mr. Quince, had taken 3 unannounced days away from his office, leaving no forwarding address and returning with a limp and a sudden reluctance to discuss property boundaries near the South Orchard. By the end of the week, what had once been scattered unease began weaving into something with form, whispers of old debts and older graves, of deeds misplaced and maps redrawn, and of a peculiar clause found in a will dating back to the founding of Marrowdown itself. Something had been buried long ago, beneath stone and silence, and now, as autumn pressed its cold breath upon the village, it seemed whatever lay beneath was pressing back with quiet, undeniable force. The morning fog clung stubbornly to the hedgerows like a living veil, smothering the village in an eerie hush that felt less like silence and more like held breath. Mrs. Eliza Harrow, wrapped in her faded green shawl and armed with a gaze sharper than any detective's, stepped out for what the villagers assumed was her daily constitutional, though those who knew better understood that Eliza never walked without purpose. This morning, that purpose weighed heavier than usual, driven by an unease she could not yet name. Her path took her past the old Dovecote ruins, where she paused upon seeing a most peculiar sight. Mr. Collingwood, the discreet and usually punctual manager of the village bank, emerging not from the front steps of Dovetail Manor as expected, but from the side stables, his shoes soiled, his face unusually flushed, and a worn leather folio clutched close to his chest as if guarding something more than financial documents. Moments later, he turned up at Ambrose Weller's cottage, the solicitor with a reputation for cleaning up the messier affairs of the landed gentry, where the 2 men spoke hurriedly behind drawn curtains for no more than 10 minutes, departing with curt nods and matching grim expressions. No tea, no pleasantries, just the clipped efficiency of men executing decisions that had already been made. Eliza marked the exact minute on the tiny notebook she kept hidden beneath her shawl, mentally charting a web that had begun to throb with quiet malice. Her attention soon shifted to the figure of young Tobias Harrington, heir to the estate in name only, engaged in what could only be called a desperate exchange with Dr. Henley, who had uncharacteristically stepped out of his surgery before the clock struck 9. The boy's hands moved with frantic gestures as he motioned toward the locked barn, and the doctor's face hardened with every word, until finally he simply nodded once and turned away, visibly disturbed. Eliza watched as the lad lingered, then slipped around the rear of the stable, glancing nervously over his shoulder. But most disturbing of all was the transformation she noted in Lucius Harrington, the cold, tight-lipped brother of the late Clara Harrington, who only a week prior had been seen weeping publicly at the churchyard, but now walked through the market square with an energy that bordered on elation. He stopped at the grocer's stall to purchase imported blood oranges, an indulgence rare even in prosperous months, and settled the account with crisp, fresh banknotes. "Strange to see him laughing," muttered old Mrs. Gleaves, who materialized at Eliza's side like a bad omen, her voice barely above a whisper. "You'd think he just inherited a fortune, not buried his only sister." Eliza offered only a nod, but her mind raced. The night before, the butcher had whispered to his apprentice that Lucius had come knocking past midnight, inquiring about several slabs of ice, an odd request, especially since the community hall's icehouse had been closed for maintenance. Even stranger, said ice was delivered not to the estate's kitchen but to the back entrance of the barn. The same barn now under lock, the same barn Tobias had been seen loitering near. Then there was the matter of Ambrose Weller's 3 separate visits this week alone, each shorter, each quieter, and each followed by the appearance of someone new at the Harrington gates. A tax assessor, a land registrar, and just this morning, a man with the bearing of a city detective dressed in plain clothes. It was as though the entire village was on the edge of something festering, something deeper than mere inheritance squabbles or rural gossip. The fog lifted slowly as Eliza returned to her ivy-covered cottage, but the weight in her chest only grew heavier. She sat by the window, her cooling tea untouched, eyes not on the newspaper, but on the barn across the distant hill, its weathered planks standing like a lie waiting to crack. She did not yet know what had happened inside it, but she could feel the truth pressing against the silence like a scream trapped behind closed lips, and she would be listening when it finally broke free. The crisp October air held a biting stillness, as if the village of St. Aldhelms had drawn in a breath it had no intention of releasing. Dry leaves skittered along cobbled lanes like tiny whispers scurrying to hide, and above the steeple, crows wheeled in slow, ominous circles. Miss Evelyn Harwood, now in the winter of her life, moved through this atmosphere not as a passive observer but as a quiet sentinel, one who had learned, during wartime intelligence work, that true danger rarely arrived with noise. Instead it crept silently in smiles that didn't reach the eyes, in patterns that made no sense until they made too much. The recent death of young Margaret Elwell had rattled the community, but only on the surface. Labeled an accident, dismissed with the usual platitudes, and buried with haste beneath the comforting rituals of liturgy, the matter might have faded entirely from the public's short memory. But Evelyn's memory was not short, nor was her instinct easily silenced. Days before Margaret's death, Evelyn had noticed small things, deliberate, quiet things. Margaret had withdrawn from the altar guild, avoided eye contact in choir, and once, during morning prayers, had wept silently through a hymn that spoke of generational sin. Evelyn hadn't pried then. She was no gossip. She waited, watched, listened, skills sharpened during years when lives depended on knowing who hesitated before answering, who flinched at the wrong word. On the morning after the funeral, when the mist still clung low to the earth, and the tolling bell echoed like a wound refusing to close, Evelyn took the long way to the vicarage, not for exercise, but to trace the exact route Margaret had often walked, past the old linden tree, the broken fence near the cemetery gate, and the cracked sundial that always ran 3 hours behind. Every corner whispered something unresolved. At the vicarage, Reverend Sinclair greeted her with the practiced calm of a man who had buried more secrets than parishioners, and though his tone was welcoming, his eyes were glassy with fatigue, as if sleep had become a stranger. "Miss Harwood," he said, rising stiffly, "how kind of you to call." She accepted his offered chair, but did not waste time with pleasantries. Instead she spoke of Margaret, her changes in demeanor, her mysterious request for penitential scriptures, and most puzzling of all, her question about inherited guilt. The Reverend's jaw tightened. He glanced at the fireplace, though it was unlit, as if seeking comfort in old warmth. "She came to me 3 weeks before," he finally said, "asked if the sins of a parent could poison the soul of a child." Evelyn's breath caught, but she remained silent. He continued, "She asked for a copy of the Lamentations, and a small bottle of anointing oil, said she needed cleansing, but wouldn't say from what." His voice faltered. She seemed frightened. "Not of someone, of something old." Evelyn leaned in, her expression unreadable. "And did you suspect she was in danger?" To pause. "I suspected she had stumbled upon something that was never meant to be found again." He stood and moved to the window, gazing toward the churchyard where long shadows clung to gravestones like regrets too old to confess. Evelyn followed his gaze, and noticed something the Reverend seemed unwilling to acknowledge. A name, faint but legible on a distant headstone. Abigail Sinclair, his younger sister, who had died mysteriously 2 decades prior in a fall never fully explained. It was all aligning now, the panic in Margaret's final days, the cryptic questions, the church's sudden repairs near the crypt, and the rumor, once dismissed as village myth, that something had been sealed beneath the chapel floor long ago. Evelyn's skin prickled. This was not about faith or ritual. This was about a buried sin clawing its way back into the light through the only descendant who dared name it. And someone with power in this village, had ensured Margaret would not live long enough to reveal it. As Evelyn stood to leave, her eyes lingered on a half-burned letter resting in the study's grate. Only one phrase remained legible: "She knows the truth about Abigail." Evelyn did not shiver, but as she stepped back into the gray morning, she knew this mystery was far from over. It had roots that ran deep beneath stone and scripture, beneath every kind smile and reverent bow, and if she didn't act soon, those roots would strangle another innocent before the village even knew they were watching someone die. Outside, the autumn rain had thickened into a slow, icy drizzle that blurred the stained glass windows of the rectory into bleeding streaks of crimson and gold, as if the very walls wept for secrets they could no longer hold. Inside, the fire crackled with a restless unease, casting flickering shadows along the bookshelves where sacred texts lay silently beside truths better left untouched. Reverend Alcott sat stiffly at his worn oak desk, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed over the drawer's edge, hesitating before he finally spoke. "Miss Winslow, I find myself in need of your judgment regarding a matter I've hesitated to share with anyone. A matter of conscience and, I fear, consequence." Alara Winslow, retired investigator, quietly closed her umbrella and stepped further into the room, her gaze steady, unreadable. She had the presence of someone who had seen too much and learned long ago never to flinch. "I'm listening," she said, her voice low, measured, braced for something dark. The Reverend reached into the drawer and withdrew a thin leather-bound hymnal, aged, brittle, and bearing the faint scent of smoke and lavender. "It belonged to Lydia Hargrave. After her death, I meant to return it to her family. But something compelled me to look inside." His voice cracked slightly as he opened it to reveal the hollowed-out core where sacred hymns had been carefully preserved around pages that had been surgically altered, repurposed into a vessel of confession. Between the verses and musical notations were handwritten entries, columns of precise, unnervingly consistent script, initials, dates, cryptic annotations, and times, some marked with symbols Alara didn't recognize at first. Her eyes narrowed. The dates spanned nearly 6 months, and matched the period during which Lydia had grown increasingly withdrawn, her gaze often distant, her presence in church restless, as if she were listening for something no one else could hear. "These aren't just notes," Alara said quietly, her finger tracing a sequence, KW. Midnight. Undercroft. No lights. Another, bell tower. 3 chimes. No return. Alara's blood chilled as she recognized the initial of 2 highly respected townspeople, both with unblemished reputations until now. She was tracking movements, Alara murmured, late-night rendezvous, coded meetings. Someone trusted her. Or perhaps someone underestimated her. The Reverend's face had gone pale. "She came to me, about a week before the accident, asked if choosing silence over exposure could ever be morally right. I told her to seek peace. I thought I was protecting her. But I fear, I only made her more alone." Alara turned another page. The entries became darker, some crossed out violently, others underlined 3 times. The ink pressed hard into the paper as if Lydia had been trembling. Voices in the crypt. Ledger burned. N said, "It's not safe anymore." She was scared. Alara said. She knew something monumental, and she was getting close to blowing it open. The Reverend's voice broke. "I thought she died in her sleep. But the coroner's report mentioned signs of cardiac distress. No clear cause. Just sudden death." Alara shut the hymnal with reverent finality. "Orchestrated silence," she whispered. "They didn't just kill her body, they wanted to erase what she knew. But she left this because some part of her believed someone might pick up where she left off." She tucked the hymnal into her coat with slow deliberation, her expression like granite. "This isn't over. We're standing on the edge of something vast and buried, Reverend. If these records are accurate, then this town's foundation is cracked by rot no one dared name aloud." The room felt colder now, as if something invisible had slipped inside with the draft, lingering near the edges of the light. "What should we do?" the Reverend asked, voice hollow with dread. Alara paused at the doorway, her eyes reflecting the dying fire. "We don't scream, we don't run. We listen, we dig, and we honor Lydia's courage, not with eulogies, but with justice." As she stepped out into the night, the rain slowed for just a moment, and the wind whispered through the ivy-covered walls, like a voice returning from the grave, reminding those still living that the truth, once unearthed, cannot be reburied without consequence. As Miss Aloan Hartley stepped out of the old iron-gated cemetery, the chilled fingers of the autumn wind coiled around her like a warning, sharp and knowing, whispering secrets only the dead dared speak. Clutched tightly in her hand was not just the fading funeral pamphlet of 17-year-old Alice Whitcomb, but the storm of revelation hidden within the girl's torn and smudged diary. A diary she had discovered, buried beneath a loose floorboard in the vestry's disused cloakroom, half-burned and reeking faintly of damp ash. Within those pages, scribbled in desperate uneven lines, lay unsettling fragments of truth, references to the silent hour, names of townspeople, long thought harmless, and strange mentions of weekly gatherings beneath the chapel during the waning moon. Aloan, once a magistrate known for her precision and incorruptibility, felt her conscience stir with an old familiar ache, the weight of moral obligation now fused with the horror that had begun to unfurl, like rot beneath her beloved Northmere-on-Lee. The village, with its vine-curtained lanes and stone cottages trimmed in ivy, no longer seemed picturesque but theatrical, its serenity a mask stretched tightly over a festering truth. Alice, spirited and curious, had clearly stumbled upon something ancient, hidden in the hollowed bones of the town's spiritual heart, and for that she had paid with her life. Her final diary entry had been little more than a frantic scrawl across a torn scrap. They meet again this Thursday. If I vanish, it's not the river, it's them. The townsfolk had dismissed her death as a tragic accident, a late-night slip into the fast-moving stream after choir rehearsal, but Aloan now knew otherwise. She could no longer be a passive observer. Determined to confront what lay beneath the town's smiling surface, she turned toward the one person she knew might believe her, Verity Langdon, the former church archivist who had been quietly exiled from parish affairs after questioning too much about the chapel's sealed-off sublevels and its vanished reliquary inventory. Their meeting, seemingly accidental near the edge of the cloister garden, had the chill of fate to it. Verity saw it instantly in Eloan's haunted gaze. Something terrible had been uncovered. "You've found it, haven't you?" she whispered. They returned at once to Eloan's ivy-draped cottage, where the hearth fire crackled with uneasy warmth and the ticking grandfather clock amplified the stillness between their words. Eloan unfolded every piece, the coded passages, the mention of a sable order, and the parish's inexplicable records gap between 1864 and 1882, a time Verity had once tried to investigate, only to find herself barred from the archives. Verity turned pale. "It's beginning again," she said. "It never stopped," Eloan replied quietly. "They just changed the way they hide." With a trembling hand, Verity fetched a thin brass key from beneath her shawl, the one they had never retrieved when she was dismissed from her duties. "This opens the vestry cellar. If anything remains, it's down there." Eloan nodded, her mind already set. "We go tonight, before the Thursday gathering. If we wait, whatever proof exists will vanish." There was a pause, heavy and dense with unspoken fear. Outside, thunder rumbled low across the hills, as though nature itself braced for what they were about to disturb. In that storm-lit silence, their pact was sealed, not only to uncover the truth about Alice's death, but to expose the ancient secretive machinery operating beneath the parish's sanctified walls. Whatever awaited them in the darkness beneath St. Jude's, Eloan knew it would be no simple matter of law or reason. This was something older, something buried not just by time, but by intent. And she was finally ready to descend into the lion's den, lantern in hand, with the knowledge that the truth, however monstrous, must be brought back into the light. When Miss Theodora Vale stepped onto the moss-dappled path leading to Stonebridge Estate, the sky hung low with clouds the color of tarnished silver, and a biting wind coiled around her ankles like something alive and watchful. The manor loomed at the crest of the slope, wrapped in creeping ivy and the brittle remains of long-dead wisteria, its windows dark and unwelcoming, its chimneys sighing smoke into the stillness like reluctant confessions. Though her visit was cast under the guise of a condolence call following the untimely death of Beatrice Delmere, the formidable and reclusive matriarch, Theodora had not come merely to offer sympathy. She had come to uncover what had been carefully concealed. Beatrice's death had been explained away as a tragic accident, a fall among her beloved greenhouse beds during a storm, found with mud on her palms and a rusted tin clutched to her chest, a tin that once held papers which mysteriously, no one had since been able to locate. But Theodora had known Beatrice, known her precision, her iron will, and most importantly, her secrets. She was greeted at the door not by grief, but by Franklin Delmere, the only son, who wore mourning like a poorly tailored suit. His posture was stiff, his tone overly polite, and though his words were kind, they were strangled by the same tension that coiled in the air of the house. The silence has been heavy, he offered, as he led her to the sitting room, the hearth newly lit, and the scent of scorched dust clinging to the air. Yes, Theodora murmured, her eyes already roaming, noting the absent family portraits on the walls, the scuffed skirting near the grandfather clock, the faint scent of camphor over something sharper, something faintly coppery, almost medicinal. The tea he served trembled in the cup as he poured, and twice his gaze flicked toward the hallway, then away, as though he feared someone might appear from the shadows. When Theodora asked about the greenhouse, about the exact circumstances of his mother's final hours, Franklin's demeanor shifted, not with sorrow, but with subtle defensiveness. She was confused, always rambling about old documents, things that didn't matter anymore. But Beatrice was not a woman who rambled. She documented, she preserved, she protected what she knew, and if she died with that tin in her hand, then it had mattered very much. Theodora pressed further, expressing an interest in the cellar archives, knowing full well that Beatrice had once hinted the family vaults were older than the estate itself, that they held remnants from the Delmere ancestors who'd trafficked in more than land and livestock during the war years. Franklin's face drained of color. The cellars are in disrepair, damp and unsafe. You wouldn't want to go down there. But she did, and with a measured smile and well-placed comment about Beatrice's famous storage practices, Theodora maneuvered him to the edge of reluctant agreement. He led her down creaking wooden steps into a darkness that felt thicker than it should have, the kind of dark that remembered things. The walls were clammy with age, and the air hummed with the faint buzz of something electrical, something that should not have been there. Behind stacks of dusty crates and crates of mislabeled bottles, she found it, a panel in the stonework, newer than the rest, painted in haste and sealed with a carpenter's hand, rather than a mason. Behind it ledgers, dozen, maps, record, receipts in code, letters signed only with initials, evidence of a sprawling black market operation tied not only to the estate, but to names long buried by polite society. Profiteering, war contracts, missing persons tied to assets too valuable to leave behind. At the center of it all, a web Beatrice had apparently been working to untangle before someone ensured she never would. Franklin reached into his coat, and for a moment the cellar went still. No wind, no creaks, no outside world. You weren't meant to see this, he said, voice low and quivering, as if surprised more by her resolve than his own actions. Theodora didn't flinch. Inspector Lorne has already been notified, she said evenly. Your options are limited, but confession might yet be your only redemption. Franklin hesitated, breath caught in his throat like a man standing before a chasm of his own making. Somewhere above them, the estate groaned in the wind, ancient beams, groaning pipes, or perhaps the house itself whispering its judgment. And in that long silence, where every second stretched like thread over flame, Theodora saw it clearly in his eyes. The house had not buried its secrets. It had merely waited for someone bold enough to listen. The library at Thornmere House had long stood like a forgotten monument to secrets, its vast oak shelves curled in dust, its velvet drapes moth-bitten and heavy with silence, and in the amber gloom, every shadow seemed to lean forward, listening, as if the walls themselves remembered things the living had tried to bury. It was in this hushed chamber of whispers and memory that Mrs. Adora Gray arrived, the storm outside slashing against the windows in wild fury, her silhouette framed in the doorway, like an omen. Her expression bore the stillness of someone who had come not seeking answers, but ready to deliver a reckoning. She removed her gloves with quiet precision, her damp coat trailing droplets across the parquet floor, and laid a thin, worn notebook on the table like one might place a weapon. Lawrence Ashcroft, seated languidly beside the hearth with a crystal tumbler of port resting against his knee, offered her a smile both courteous and hollow. "Miss Gray," he said smoothly, "your visit was unexpected." His voice carried the silkiness of practiced charm, but beneath it the faintest tremor betrayed him, and Isadora caught it, like a predator sensing wounded prey. "I imagine it was," she replied, eyes scanning the rows of books that hadn't been opened in years, just as Eliza's disappearance was deemed unexpected by those who didn't want to look too closely. That name, Eliza, made Lawrence shift in his seat, but he masked it with a sip of port, the glass trembling ever so slightly in his hand. Isadora didn't need him to respond. The air had already thickened with unspoken truths. You remember her, don't you? She continued. Quiet girl. Shy, but observant. Too observant. She noticed things others overlooked, the late-night visitors, the odd invoices, the packages routed through the Ashcroft docks marked as dairy exports but weighted wrong. She didn't understand all of it at first, but she began writing it down, and she kept that record hidden where only someone desperate for the truth would find it. She gestured to the notebook, its pages wrinkled, some ink smudged by fear or by tears. Names, times, passcodes. A detailed map of this house, including the narrow corridor behind the pantry that leads directly to your private study. You were clever, Lawrence. You used your family's import business as cover for something far older, far darker than black market goods. These weren't mere transactions, they were disappearances, girls who left no trace, no family to question their absence. Because you chose them carefully, didn't you? You preyed on the forgotten. The fire snapped violently in the hearth as if reacting, throwing flickers of light across Lawrence's face, now stripped of its genial mask, leaving behind a tight, watchful stare. You're mistaken, he said flatly. Dangerously mistaken, am I? Isadora's voice was low now, almost tender, like a lullaby at a funeral. Then you won't mind knowing that Eliza's final entry described a confrontation, a moment when she caught sight of something, or someone, she wasn't meant to see. That's why her body was never found, isn't it? Because you didn't leave a body. You erased her, or so you thought. For a moment, Lawrence said nothing. His knuckles whitened on the edge of the armrest. The storm outside was now a roar, rattling the panes like a trapped animal. You forget, he said at last, with a voice now dry and cold. This house has existed for over 2 centuries. It's seen more blood than you can imagine. Things happen here that never reach the village, and no one questions me. No one ever has. But even as he spoke, the illusion was dying. Miss Grey stepped aside, revealing the glint of steel tucked behind her, a constable's badge, damp with rain. That's where you're wrong, she whispered. Inspector Vale is waiting at the north gate. I took the liberty of giving him copies of every page in Eliza's journal, along with photographs from the hidden crawlspace behind your fireplace, where fragments of a bloodied apron were recovered this morning. Lawrence's expression finally cracked, and what surfaced was not fear, but fury. A kind of cold ancestral rage passed down through men who'd never faced consequence. But before he could move, heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. The door creaked open, and justice entered in the form of 2 armed constables with silent authority in their eyes. As Lawrence stood, defiant even now, Miss Grey turned to him once more, her voice like frost. You built this house on silence, Lawrence. But every silence eventually becomes an echo. And Eliza's echo was loud enough to bring it all down. And as he was led away through the shadows of his own ancestral prison, Thornmere House seemed to exhale, as if the truth had finally burned away the rot in its walls, and the ghosts could rest, knowing one of their own had been heard. Harold's facade, once so meticulously constructed with the precision of a man who believed his intelligence rendered him untouchable, had begun to visibly fracture, a fine tremor working its way into his hands, as Miss Evelyn Whitmore, seated with deceptive calm at the far end of the parlor, continued to unravel his world stitch by stitch, her fingers moving almost absently through a length of lace she wasn't even watching. Penhaligon, she said gently, her tone the sort that might be used on an elderly gentleman who'd misplaced his spectacles. Your recent attempts to appear baffled would be far more convincing were it not for the very specific clues your operation has so carelessly left behind. Harold scoffed, but the sound died in his throat when she lifted her eyes, pale, unblinking, and clinical, like a surgeon preparing for an incision. My visit to your facility yesterday was officially logged as a condolence call, and I imagine your staff took no particular notice of a grieving old woman inspecting corners with a shaking hand and an over-politeness that encouraged them to ignore me. But I noticed. The refrigeration units marked for dairy storage were fitted with false backings and concealed vents. The crates labeled salted butter were packed with a consistency and weight entirely wrong for any dairy product. And then there's the curious presence of high-powered chemical solvents in your toolshed, the kind not needed for milking, but very much needed for processing illicit pharmaceuticals. You see, Harold, your struggling dairy farm is little more than a front, a clever one, yes, with its wholesome facade and rustic branding, but behind it is an industrial-grade narcotics operation, so deeply rooted it likely stretches beyond county lines. Her voice dropped an octave, the air itself seeming to constrict around her next words. In Mildred Stanning, your longest-serving and most loyal employee, she knew, Inspector Mallory, now scribbling at a furious pace in his notebook, barely glanced up as Harold's complexion paled. I believe Mildred began to suspect the truth weeks ago. Her devotion to order and routine brought her again and again to the lower storerooms, where she began to notice the discrepancies, the altered stock logs, the deliveries made at odd hours, the doors to areas she was suddenly told she could no longer enter. And when she stumbled upon something undeniable, a ledger perhaps, or a mislabeled shipment that arrived half unsealed, she did not run, she documented, she recorded, and she planned to act. But you couldn't allow that, could you, Harold? Evelyn stood, her voice now laced with iron beneath the velvet. You had invested years into this enterprise, enough to erase your debts, rebuild your estate, and pay off associates like Dr. Halbert and Mr. Pike, men whose names appeared suspiciously often in the visitor logs during nights when the farm was supposed to be locked and dark. You stood to lose everything, including your freedom. So when Mildred confronted you, perhaps not even accusingly, but simply asking questions, you struck. Maybe it was impulsive, maybe it was planned, but what followed was unmistakably murder. You dragged her to the churning shed, the one rarely used with poor lighting and no cameras, and staged a tragic accident. The torn hem of her uniform, the pool of spoiled cream curdled with streaks of blood, the oversized footprints leading into, but not away from, the scene. She never left that shed, and you believed no one would question it. But you forgot something, Harold. She held up a small slip of yellowed paper, its edges crumpled, its handwriting meticulous. Mildred had written everything in a code she believed only she understood. But unfortunately for you, she once taught that code to my niece during Sunday lessons, and I have read every single word. Harold's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from his eyes, replaced not by guilt, but by a slow coiling dread, the kind that comes when a man realizes the walls are not just closing in, they've already locked. The inspector rose silently, nodding to the officers outside, and as Harold was led away through the same door where so many of his shipments had quietly come and gone, Eveline returned to her chair, resumed her lacework and whispered, "It's always the details, dear, and I do so adore details." Detective Mallory had stopped taking notes. His pen hovered motionless above the page, his eyes locked on Harold's increasingly ashen face, a man whose internal collapse had become a visible, unraveling performance. What had once been feigned indignation was now replaced with a hollow, unfocused stare, the expression of someone no longer fighting for innocence but bracing for the final blow. Miss Eveline Whitmore's voice, low and deliberate, cut through the silence like a blade through silk. "The cruelest irony," she said, almost tenderly, "is that poor Annabel didn't even come searching for evidence. All she sought was clarity for her soul." She paused, letting the weight of that truth settle like dust on a coffin. The letter she requested, not a resignation or accusation, but a simple handwritten plea for guidance tucked between the pages of her prayer book, was her way of wrestling with the right thing to do. Her conscience was heavy, and yet she had no idea how far the rot had spread. She suspected Harold, yes, but never imagined the reach of his corruption, nor the depths he would sink to protect it. A stillness swept over the room, the kind that precedes storms or confessions. The elderly detective folded her spectacles calmly and placed them beside the coded journal she had recovered. Annabel's silent witness from beyond the grave. And with that simple gesture Harold finally broke. His shoulders sagged like a man crushed beneath the weight of his own secrets. "It wasn't meant to go that far," he muttered, voice flat, eyes hollow, as if watching a scene from his life unfold without him. She wasn't supposed to fight back. His words trailed into nothing, but the damage was done. The admission hung in the air, raw and irreversible, while Inspector Mallory stepped forward, slipping the handcuffs over Harold's trembling wrists with a formality that seemed almost respectful, as if recognizing the enormity of the human failure before him. But Miss Whitmore said nothing more. She only watched as the man was led away, her gaze not vengeful but somber, like someone who understood that true justice always carried a cost. As the others departed, their silhouettes swallowed by the chill dusk, Eveline lingered in the drawing room, where the fire had turned to embers and the shadows clung to the walls like memory. She stood alone in the silence that followed, staring at the empty chair where Annabel once sat during tea, correcting inventory books with neat handwriting and quiet humility. Though the village of Elmsford would soon return to its usual rhythm, chickens fed, shop doors opened, gossip exchanged over hedgerows, the knowledge of what had transpired beneath their noses would remain like an invisible stain. No cleansing rain could wash away. For some the headlines would fade. For Eveline, the memory of that night would never soften. Justice had been done, yes, but not without tearing open the fragile skin of the community, exposing veins of greed, betrayal and cowardice beneath its pastoral charm. Outside, the wind whispered through bare trees, and the first breath of winter curled under the eaves. But for Eveline Whitmore some winters of the soul never truly ended, they simply settled in quiet and permanent. She turned off the light and whispered to the dark. It's not the crime that haunts us, it's the silence that comes after. Thank you for joining us for the Elmsford confession. Did you suspect Harold before the final unraveling? Or were you caught off guard by the shadows behind his respectable smile? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoyed this chilling descent into human deceit, don't forget to subscribe for more investigations led by Eveline Whitmore. Until next time, remember, evil rarely wears horns. It wears good shoes, smiles politely and blends in until it's too late.